Imagine, if you can, a single human life that spans an entire century.
And not just any century.
No, we are talking about the American century. A timeline that starts in post-World War I Germany, moves through the rise of the Nazis, the inferno of the Second World War, the Cold War.
The fall of the Berlin Wall, the unipolar moment of the 90s, all the way to, the age of AI and a rising China.
It's a narrative that, if you wrote it as fiction, people would say is a little too on the nose.
A bit much, yeah. If you pitched it, a Jewish refugee flees Nazi Germany, comes back in a U.S. Army uniform to hunt Gestapo, and then becomes the very face of American global power. A publisher would probably tell you to tone it down.
Tone it down is right. We are, of course, talking about Henry Kissinger. Born 1923, died 2023. He lived to be 100 years old. And for a massive, absolutely pivotal chunk of that time, he wasn't just watching history.
No, he was in the room with his hands on the steering wheel.
And that's where this story really stops being just a biography and becomes, I think, a debate about the very soul of modern foreign policy.
It absolutely does, because depending on who you talk to, Henry Kissinger was either the most brilliant diplomatic strategist of the 20th century, the architect of the opening to China, the man who ended the Vietnam War.
Or he was a monster.
The polarization is just, it's off the charts.
It really is. You have a 2014 poll of international relations scholars, actual experts in the field, ranking him as the most effective Secretary of State in 50 years.
And then on the other side, you have someone like Anthony Bourdain, who famously said that after you've been to Cambodia, you'll want to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands.
Or Christopher Hitchens, who wrote an entire book with the title The Trial of Henry Kissinger, explicitly calling him a war criminal.
And that extreme divide, that chasm in perception, is exactly what we need to unpack today. It is so easy to fall back on the characters.
Genius strategist on one side.
And the Beltway butcher on the other. But our mission for this deep dive is to try and move past that, to look at the record. We've got a mountain of sources here. Biographies, declassified cables, his own memoirs, those famous telephone transcripts.
The telecoms, yeah.
The goal is to understand the why. We need to get inside the machinery of this philosophy he lived by. Realpolitik.
Realpolitik. It's a word you hear all the time, but it usually just gets used as a synonym for, being cynical or tough.
Right, but it's so much more than that. It's a whole worldview. It's a belief that foreign policy shouldn't be driven by idealism or morality, as we traditionally think of it.
So what should it be based on?
A cold, hard calculation of power, of national interest, and above all else, stability. It's the idea that order is almost always preferable to justice.
Order is preferable to justice.
Oh.
Wow. That is a heavy, heavy statement.
It is.
And to really understand how someone gets to a place like that, I feel like we can't start in the Nixon White House. We have to go all the way back.
You have to. You have to start in Fürth, Bavaria.
You cannot understand Henry Kissinger without first understanding Heinz Kissinger.
That was his birth name, yes. Heinz Alfred Kissinger. Born in 1923 into a pretty typical middle-class German Jewish family. They were patriotic. His father was a very well-respected school teacher. For the first 10 years of his life, he was a German kid who was obsessed with soccer.
And then 1933 happens. Hitler comes to power. Heinz is 9 years old.
And his entire world is just turned upside down. The accounts from that time they're heartbreaking. Friends he played soccer with in the street, they suddenly joined the Hitler Youth and stopped talking to him.
Or worse.
Or worse. They beat him up. He'd see boys he grew up with, now in uniforms, and they would attack him just for being Jewish.
There's that one detail in the biographies about the soccer stadium that just gets me every time.
Oh, with his team, SBVG Fürth.
Yeah, he was obsessed with them.
But after the Nuremberg laws are passed, Jews are banned from the stadiums. And he wouldn't accept it. It's this first real glimpse into his personality, I think. He would sneak in. He'd try to blend in with the crowd, but he had this, distinctive look, and security or Hitler Youth members would spot him.
And they'd drag him out and beat him.
Yes. And the next week, he'd do it again. Just this incredible stubbornness.
But the walls are closing in. His father loses his teaching job.
Yeah.
The family is being systematically stripped of their rights and their dignity. And finally, in 1938, his mother, Paula, who really seems to have been the practical one,
the driving force,
she decides they have to get out. Now,
And they were so lucky they got out just months before Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. They made it to London, then to New York City, and settled in Washington Heights.
Frankfurt on the Hudson.
That's what they called it, yeah, because of all the German Jewish refugees. And that is where Heinz becomes Henry.
Now, here's a really interesting psychological point. Later in life, Kissinger always downplayed this period. He'd sort of brush it off, saying the Nazi era didn't really shape his worldview in the way people assumed.
He did. He famously wrote something like, "The Germany of my youth had a lot of order and very little justice, so it wasn't exactly a great advertisement for order."
Which is a clever line.
It is, but most scholars, including his main biographer, Walter Isaacson, think he's really rationalizing there. I mean, think about it. He witnessed firsthand a modern, civilized, democratic society, the Weimar Republic, completely collapse into barbarism.
Because the structure failed.
Because the order disintegrated. He saw what happens when you have chaos. You get Hitler.
So for him, the absolute worst-case scenario isn't tyranny. The worst-case scenario is chaos.
Exactly. Chaos is the vacuum. Monsters are born in the vacuum. So for the rest of his 100-year life, his prime directive, the thing that overrides almost everything else, is the pursuit of stability, of equilibrium.
Even if that stability means you have to make deals with monsters.
Even then, because it's better than the alternative.
So he's in New York, he's working in a shaving brush factory, going to night school, keeping that thick German accent his whole life. And then, 1943. The U.S. Army drafts him.
And this is what transforms him. It gives him a new identity. He's not just a refugee anymore, he's an American soldier. And because he's brilliant and a native German speaker, he gets fast-tracked into counterintelligence.
Well, then he goes back to Germany.
He goes back, but this time he's the one with the gun and the authority.
That story about him in the town of Krefeld is just, it's incredible.
Yeah.
He's this 20-year-old private first class, and he basically ends up running the entire civilian administration of the city because all the officials had fled.
He was hunting Gestapo officers, rooting out Nazi stay-behind networks. He earned a Bronze Star for it. It's the ultimate role reversal.
But there is one specific moment, one day during the war, that we have to focus on. April 1945.
The Alm concentration camp.
Yes. His unit participates in the liberation of this camp, which was a subcamp of a larger one.
And he wrote about it in his journal, the descriptions.
It's just brutal. I have it here. He wrote, "I had never seen people degrading to the level that people were in Alam. They barely looked human. They were skeletons. They had been beaten and starved and worked until they dropped."
To see that with your own eyes, it has to reinforce that core belief we just talked about. This is what happens when civilization breaks. This is the bottom. This is the abyss of chaos.
So when he comes back and goes to Harvard on the GI Bill, he isn't just looking for an education.
No, he's looking for a theory of everything. He's looking for a way to structure the world so that Alem never happens again.
And by all accounts, he hits Harvard like a bomb. His undergraduate thesis is the stuff of legend.
Oh, the meaning of history. It was almost 400 pages long. It was so dense, covering Spengler, Toynbee, Kant, that Harvard actually created a page limit for all future undergrad theses.
They literally named the rule after him.
The Kissinger rule, yes.
But it's his doctoral dissertation that really creates the intellectual blueprint for his entire career, isn't it?
It is. It was called Peace, Legitimacy, and the Equilibrium. And he wasn't studying something modern. He went back to the 19th century, to the Congress of Vienna.
Where the great powers of Europe tried to put the world back together after the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars.
Exactly. He studied these old world diplomats, Metternich from Austria, Castlereagh from Britain, and in their actions he found this core concept that he called legitimacy.
Okay, we really have to define this, because this word legitimacy is the key to everything. He doesn't mean legitimate in the way you and I would use it, like a fairly elected government.
Not at all. In the Kissingerian dictionary, legitimacy is a very specific technical term. It has nothing to do with justice or democracy. It simply means, do all the major powers, the great powers, agree on the basic rules of the game?
So if the U.S., the Soviet Union, and China all accept the borders and the spheres of influence, even if they hate each other, the system is legitimate.
Precisely. In that system, you have stability. You have order. A power that rejects the system, like, say, Germany after World War I, becomes what he called a revolutionary power.
And revolutionary powers are dangerous. They want to burn the whole thing down.
So the job of the statesman, the great diplomat, is to keep the great powers inside the tent, keep them balanced, keep them satisfied.
Even if it means sacrificing the interests of smaller countries to do it.
The smaller countries are, well, they're the currency of great power politics. They are the pawns on the chessboard that you move, and sometimes sacrifice, to keep the major pieces from toppling each other.
It is an incredibly cold logic.
It is. But you can see how, in an age with thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at everyone, that logic might seem not just appealing, but necessary.
Which brings us to how he first made his name outside of academia, his book in 1957.
Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. It became a bestseller, which is just wild for a dense book on foreign policy.
It was controversial, right?
Very. He made this argument that the U.S. policy of massive retaliation, if the Soviets invade West Berlin, we launch everything, was insane. It was a suicide pact. He suggested that maybe you could fight and win a limited nuclear war using smaller, tactical nuclear weapons.
That's terrifying.
It terrified people, yes. But it also made him seem like a serious man, a hard-nosed realist who wasn't afraid to think the unthinkable. And that reputation is what eventually puts him on the radar of Richard Nixon.
The ultimate odd couple.
You really couldn't invent two more different people. Nixon, the grocer's son from California, full of resentments, hating the East Coast elites.
And Kissinger, the Harvard professor, the darling of that same elite, a guy who loved the Georgetown cocktail party circuit.
And it's funny, in 1968, Kissinger was working for Nelson Rockefeller, who was Nixon's rival for the Republican nomination. We have him on record calling Nixon the most dangerous of all the men running.
He said he was unfit for the presidency.
He did. And then a few weeks after Nixon wins, he gets the call offering him the job of National Security Advisor, and he takes it instantly.
That's ambition for you.
But once they were together, they found they had this incredible bond. They were both outsiders in their own way. They were both paranoid. They were both obsessed with secrecy. And they shared this deep, deep distrust of the federal bureaucracy.
Absolutely. The State Department.
Oh, they saw the State Department as a bunch of leaky, soft-headed liberals who would undermine their grand plans. So they created a system where all the important foreign policy decisions were made by the two of them in secret from the White House basement.
Which leads directly to what even his harshest critics will often concede was his masterpiece.
The opening to China.
It's hard to overstate what a huge deal this was.
It was a geopolitical earthquake. You have to put yourself back in 1969. The U.S. is trapped in Vietnam. The Cold War with the Soviet Union is in this deep freeze. And China is just this enormous, isolated, hostile question mark. The U.S. hadn't had any diplomatic contact with mainland China since 1949.
We didn't even recognize them. We pretended the real China was the government in Taiwan.
Right. But Kissinger saw an opportunity. He realized the communist world wasn't a monolith. In fact, the Soviets and the Chinese hated each other. They were having border clashes, shooting at each other.
So he thought, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
It was triangulation. If the U.S. could get China on its side, it would completely isolate the Soviet Union. It would terrify them. It would force them to negotiate on things like arms control. It would change the entire balance of the Cold War.
And so begins this incredible cloak and dagger operation in July 1971.
It's pure spy novel stuff. Kissinger is on a public trip through Asia. While he's in Pakistan, he fakes a stomach illness.
Delhi belly, I think, was the excuse.
That was it. He's taken to a hill station to recover. The press corps is told he's resting, but in the middle of the night, he slips out, gets in an unmarked car, and is driven to an airport where a Pakistani plane is waiting to fly him in secret to Beijing.
Can you imagine the feeling on that plane? You're heading into the heart of what America considered its mortal enemy. You have no idea what the reception will be.
Nerves of absolute steel. He lands and he begins these marathon talks with the Chinese premier, Zhou Enlai. And they hit it off. They talk philosophy, history, they bond over their mutual dislike of the Soviets. But there was one huge sticking point.
Taiwan.
The Chinese said, we can't have a relationship until you admit that Taiwan is part of China. And the U.S. had a defense treaty with Taiwan.
So here comes the realpolitik.
This is a textbook example. Kissinger and Nixon made the calculation. The strategic prize of an alliance with 1 billion people in mainland China against the Soviet Union was worth more than our commitment to the government on Taiwan.
They traded them.
In essence, yes. He agreed to what became the One China policy.
Yeah.
He promised the U.S. would eventually pull its troops out of Taiwan. He dismissed the American effort to keep Taiwan in the UN as a doomed rearguard action.
And it worked. The next year, 1972, Nixon goes to China, shakes Mao's hand. The photos are iconic. The Soviets are panicked. The entire global chessboard is tilted in America's favor.
A stunning diplomatic achievement.
While they're celebrating this grand strategic victory, There is a very hot, very bloody war still raging in Southeast Asia.
Vietnam.
And the realpolitik applied there was a lot messier and a lot deadlier.
This is the deepest, darkest shadow on Kissinger's entire legacy. There's no getting around it.
When he and Nixon came into office in '69, they knew the war was basically unwinnable in a military sense, right?
They did. They knew pretty quickly that short of a massive, politically impossible escalation, they couldn't just beat the North Vietnamese on the battlefield. The American public was done with the war.
So the goalpost shifted. It wasn't about victory anymore. It was about peace with honor.
Which is a great slogan. But what it actually meant was finding a way for the U.S. to get out of Vietnam without looking like it had been defeated. It was all about American credibility.
He believed that if the U.S. just packed up and left, it would be a signal of weakness to the whole world. No ally would ever trust a U.S. security guarantee again.
So they needed a strategy to withdraw, but to leave the South Vietnamese government in place for long enough that the U.S. could claim it hadn't abandoned its ally.
And this is where we get to the decent interval theory. It's one of the most cynical foreign policy concepts I've ever heard of.
It is. The accusation, which is backed by a lot of evidence from their own tapes, is that Kissinger and Nixon knowingly negotiated a peace agreement that they believed would ultimately fail.
But they just needed it to hold together for a year or two.
Exactly. Get the American POWs home, get the American troops out, and then if South Vietnam collapses 18 months or 2 years later, well, that's a tragedy, but it's not America's fault. The interval creates plausible deniability.
We have the transcripts. We have Kissinger telling Nixon that the terms of the Paris Peace Accords would eventually destroy the South Vietnamese President Thieu.
He told the Chinese that the U.S. wasn't necessarily committed to a permanent South Vietnam. The goal was an exit strategy, not a lasting peace.
And to get to that exit strategy, to force North Vietnam to the table on their terms, they didn't de-escalate the war, they expanded it.
Which brings us to Cambodia.
Operation Menu. This is maybe the single most damning part of his record.
The North Vietnamese army was using trails through officially neutral Cambodia to supply their forces in the south. It was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So Nixon and Kissinger decided to bomb those supply lines and sanctuaries.
But they couldn't do it publicly because bombing a neutral country is an act of war.
So they did it in total secrecy. They created a separate, clandestine system of record-keeping to hide the bombing runs from Congress, from the American people, even from the Secretary of the Air Force.
And the scale of this bombing is just mind-boggling.
It's almost incomprehensible. The U.S. dropped more tons of bombs on rural Cambodia than the Allies dropped on Japan during all of World War II.
The civilian cost.
The estimates vary, but credible sources put the number of Cambodian civilian deaths from the bombing somewhere between 50,000 and 150,000 people.
The strategic result was an absolute catastrophe, wasn't it?
It was arguably one of the worst foreign policy blunders in U.S. history. The bombing completely destabilized the neutral government of Cambodia. It shattered the rural society. And it drove hundreds of thousands of enraged, radicalized peasants into the arms of a tiny, fanatical communist insurgency.
A Khmer Rouge.
An obscure group that almost no one had heard of before the bombing. The bombing campaign was the single greatest recruitment tool Pol Pot ever had.
And we know what happened next. The Khmer Rouge take power, and you get the killing fields. The murder of almost 2 million people.
Kissinger would argue for the rest of his life that they didn't cause the Khmer Rouge to win. But the evidence is overwhelming that the U.S. bombing created the conditions, the chaos, that made their victory possible.
It's the ultimate tragic irony of his philosophy. In the name of preserving order for American credibility, he unleashed absolute genocidal chaos on Cambodia.
And yet, in the middle of all this, he and his North Vietnamese counterpart, Le Duc Tho, are awarded the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the Paris Peace Accords.
It's just surreal.
The war was still raging on the ground. 2 members of the Nobel Committee resigned in protest, which had never happened before.
And Le Duc Tho, he turned it down.
He refused to accept it. He said, with perfect clarity, peace has not yet been restored. He had the integrity to reject it.
So what did Kissinger do?
He accepted with humility. He donated the prize money to a scholarship for children of American soldiers killed in Vietnam. He was afraid to go to Oslo to pick it up because of the protests. And then, in 1975, when Saigon fell exactly as the decent interval had predicted, he actually tried to return the medal.
And they wouldn't take it back.
The Nobel Committee refused to take it back, so he was stuck with it. A peace prize for a peace that never was.
It's an incredible story. But Vietnam and Cambodia, as dark as they are, weren't the only places where this great power chess game had lethal consequences.
By long shot.
Let's turn to South Asia. The year is 1971, the Bangladesh Liberation War. This is a moment that I think most Americans know very little about, but it's a defining event in that part of the world.
It's huge. So Pakistan at the time was split into two parts, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, which were separated by India. In 71, the military dictatorship in West Pakistan launched a horrific military crackdown on East Pakistan, which was pushing for independence.
And we say horrific.
We're talking about what was widely described at the time as a genocide. Mass killings, systematic rape as a weapon of war, targeting intellectuals and leaders. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Millions fled into India as refugees.
And the U.S. had diplomats on the ground in East Pakistan, in the city of Dhaka. They were seeing this happen.
Yes, the consul general there was a career diplomat named Archer Blood, a man of incredible integrity. And he and his staff were watching this slaughter unfold, and they were cabling Washington, begging them to do something to condemn the violence.
And they were being ignored.
Completely ignored. So Archer Blood did something almost unprecedented. He and 20 of his staff signed and sent a formal dissent cable through official channels. It's now known as the Blood Telegram.
It's one of the most powerful documents in the history of American diplomacy. I have a line from it here. It says, "Our government has failed to denounce the suppression of democracy. Our government has failed to denounce atrocities. The overworked term, genocide, is applicable."
He used the word genocide.
He did. He accused the U.S. government of moral bankruptcy. And how did Kissinger and Nixon respond to this courageous act of truth-telling?
They fired him.
They recalled Archer Blood. They ended his career. They shot the messenger.
But why? Why would the U.S. side with a government committing genocide?
One word, China. Remember when this is happening?
Uh-huh.
Mid-1971. The dictator of Pakistan, Yahya Khan, was the secret go-between. He was the one carrying Kissinger's messages to Beijing to set up the secret trip.
So they couldn't risk upsetting him. To Kissinger, the opening to China was the grand prize. It was the move that would change the world. And if the price of that prize was turning a blind eye to the slaughter of Bengalis, so be it. The smaller country was sacrificed for the great power game.
The private comments from the Oval Office tapes from this time are just vile.
They are stomach-turning. You have Nixon and Kissinger egging each other on. Kissinger is recorded calling the Indians who were helping the Bengalis bastards. He called the Indian Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, a bitch. He later said he regretted the language, but it reveals the contempt they had for anyone who got in the way of their grand strategy.
It's perfectly consistent with the Realpolitik framework, though. Pakistan was the U.S. ally and the key to China. India was seen as pro-Soviet. Therefore, Pakistan gets a pass.
And you see this same cold logic applied to an issue that should have been deeply personal for Kissinger, the plight of Soviet Jews.
Right. There was a huge movement in the U.S. Congress to pressure the Soviet Union to allow its Jewish citizens to emigrate.
But for Kissinger, this was just an annoying distraction. He was in the middle of negotiating the first major arms control treaty, SALT West. He was trying to establish détente, a relaxation of tensions with the Soviets. He didn't want messy human rights issues getting in the way.
And this leads to another one of those Oval Office tapes that is just chilling. It's from 1973.
Yes. He's talking to Nixon after a meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, and he tells Nixon, the emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union is not an objective of American foreign policy.
And then he goes further.
He does. He says, and if they put Jews into gas chambers in the Soviet Union, it is not an American concern. Maybe a humanitarian concern.
To hear a man who fled the Nazis, who lost more than a dozen relatives in the Holocaust, say that if the Soviets start using gas chambers, it's not an American concern. I mean, it's almost impossible to process.
It is the ultimate expression of his ability to compartmentalize, to separate the personal from the political. He truly believed that if you let moral outrage guide your foreign policy, you get crusades. And crusades lead to endless, catastrophic wars.
So in his mind, ignoring the gas chambers is what prevents a nuclear war that would kill everyone.
That is the steelman argument for his position, yes. That by securing détente, he was preventing a nuclear holocaust, and compared to that, all other tragedies were, in his cold calculus, secondary.
Okay. So we've looked at the exhibits for the war criminal case. Let's pivot to the Middle East, because if Vietnam and Bangladesh are Exhibit A for the prosecution, the Yom Kippur War is almost always Exhibit A for the defense.
It is. This is where his supporters say you can see the genius of Realpolitik in action.
So, set the scene. October 1973.
On Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launch a massive, coordinated surprise attack on Israel. The Israeli military is caught completely by surprise. The first few days of the war are a complete disaster for them.
And by this point, Kissinger is no longer just national security advisor. He is now also Secretary of State. And Nixon is completely consumed by Watergate.
So Kissinger is effectively running U.S. foreign policy on his own. He's the acting president when it comes to this crisis.
And his first move is fascinating. He actually delays sending weapons to Israel.
He does. He holds back the airlift. The theory is that he wanted Israel to bleed a little. He felt that if Israel won another swift, crushing victory like in 1967, they would become arrogant and would never feel the need to negotiate for peace. He wanted a stalemate.
That's playing with fire.
It is. But then he sees the Soviets pouring weapons into Syria and Egypt, and he realizes the balance is tipping too far. The Arabs might actually win. So he flips the switch and authorizes Operation Nickel Grass.
A massive round-the-clock airlift of American tanks, ammunition, everything Israel needs.
It saves Israel from defeat. But then, as the tide turns and the Israeli army is about to encircle and destroy the entire Egyptian Third Army, Kissinger steps in again. He forces the Israelis to stop.
Why do that?
Because his goal wasn't just to save Israel, it was to reshape the entire Middle East. By saving the Egyptian army from total humiliation, he gave the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, a reason to turn away from the Soviets and toward the United States. It was a brilliant move.
And this is what leads to shuttle diplomacy.
The famous images of him on his plane, flying constantly between capitals. He was a force of nature. He'd spend hours negotiating with Golda Meir in Tel Aviv, then fly to Damascus to haggle with Hafez al-Assad, whom he called a riverboat gambler.
And he brokers a deal.
He brokers disengagement agreements that separated the armies and stabilized the situation. It was a diplomatic masterclass that laid the foundation for the Camp David Accords a few years later, and crucially, it effectively kicked the Soviet Union out of the Middle East. For the next 40 years, the U.S. was the indispensable power in the region.
But there was a price for that airlift, wasn't there?
Oh, yes. The Arab oil embargo. The Arab states, led by Saudi Arabia, were furious about the U.S. support for Israel, so they cut off the oil.
Leading to gas lines around the bloc, a massive economic shock in the West.
But even there, Kissinger managed to turn a crisis into an opportunity, eventually forging the petrodollar system with the Saudis that stabilized the global economy for decades.
So, the Middle East, you could call it a win for his brand of diplomacy. But then we have to turn our gaze south to America's backyard.
To Latin America.
And this is where that cold realpolitik just looks like straight-up support for fascism.
In Latin America, the Kissinger doctrine was simple. No more Cubas. He had zero tolerance for left-wing governments in the Western Hemisphere, democratically elected or not.
Which brings us to Chile, 1970. The socialist candidate, Salvador Allende, wins a free and fair election.
And Kissinger and Nixon are immediately hostile. This is where we get one of his most infamous quotes. He said, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people."
The irresponsibility of its own people. It's such an incredibly arrogant and anti-democratic statement.
It's the order over justice thesis in its purest form. A democratic vote that produces what he considers a revolutionary outcome is, in his view, an illegitimate vote. The stability of the hemisphere trumps the will of the Chilean people.
So the CIA was authorized to undermine Allende's government, to make the economy scream.
They did. And in September 1973, the military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, launched a coup. Allende was killed. And Pinochet established one of the most brutal dictatorships in modern history.
We're talking torture, concentration camps, political opponents being thrown from helicopters. Thousands disappeared.
And Kissinger not only supported Pinochet, he defended him. There's a damning piece of evidence where the U.S. ambassador to Chile, who was horrified by the human rights abuses, wanted to send an official diplomatic letter warning the Pinochet regime against assassinating its political opponents abroad.
And Kissinger ordered him not to send it.
He personally canceled the cable. A few weeks later, a car bomb planted by Pinochet's agents exploded in Sheridan Circle in Washington, D.C., killing a prominent Chilean dissident, Orlando Letelier, and his American colleague.
It's sickening. And it's not an isolated case. There's also Argentina.
The Dirty War,
Yeah.
1976. Another military junta takes power and begins a campaign of mass murder against suspected leftists.
And this is where we have the green light meeting.
Yes. Kissinger meets with the Argentine foreign minister. The Argentine is worried about condemnation from the U.S. Congress. And Kissinger basically tells him not to worry about the White House. He says, and this is a quote, "If there are things that have to be done, you should do them quickly."
In other words, do your killing now before Congress comes back from recess and cuts off your funding.
It was perceived as a clear green light from the highest level of the U.S. government. The U.S. ambassador in Buenos Aires at the time, Robert Hill, was appalled by the slaughter and was trying to push a human rights agenda, but Kissinger completely undercut him.
And this all took place under the umbrella of a larger program, right? Operation Condor.
Operation Condor was a coordinated, multinational intelligence and assassination program set up by the right-wing dictatorships of the southern Cone Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay.
They hunted down their political opponents across borders.
Exactly. They shared intelligence, they kidnapped people in one country and sent them to be tortured in another. It was a state-sponsored terror network. And the CIA and Kissinger's State Department were, at a minimum, aware of it and did nothing to stop it.
Because these dictators were anti-communist. They provided order.
They were our guys.
There are two other cases from this period we have to mention. Cyprus in 1974.
Classic Kissinger. A coup in Cyprus backed by the military junta in Greece, followed by a Turkish invasion of the island, a war between two NATO allies.
And Kissinger's response.
He tilted toward Turkey, which he saw as the more important strategic prize. He basically allowed the invasion to happen. There's a report he said the Turkish approach was correct. Grab what they want and then negotiate.
Which led to the permanent partition of Cyprus and massive anti-American riots in Greece.
That's when Kissinger murderer became a popular chant there.
And then, maybe the most clear-cut case of all. East Timor, 1975.
This one is just, there's no ambiguity. President Gerald Ford and Kissinger are in Jakarta meeting with the Indonesian dictator Suharto.
And Suharto tells them he's about to invade the newly independent nation of East Timor.
And he asks for America's blessing. The declassified transcript of the meeting is just shocking. Kissinger tells Suharto, "It is important that whatever you do succeeds quickly." And then he adds a request.
We would be able to influence the reaction in America if whatever happens, happens after we return.
He literally says, "Please just wait until our plane is in the air. Don't embarrass us by invading while we're still here." The day after they left, Indonesia invaded using American-made weapons.
And the result was a near genocide.
A quarter of the population of East Timor, maybe 200,000 people, died during the Indonesian occupation that followed.
When you add it all up, Cambodia, Bangladesh, Chile, Argentina, East Timor, the body count is staggering. And yet the man himself didn't just survive these controversies, he thrived. He became a celebrity.
The first celebrity diplomat, it was a completely new phenomenon. He was on the cover of magazines. He was photographed at fancy clubs like Studio 54. He was dating Hollywood actresses.
Which is where that famous line comes from. Power is the ultimate aphrodisiac.
He knew how to cultivate an image, but his ego was also his greatest weakness. Which brings us to the disastrous Oriana Fallaci interview.
Oh, the cowboy interview.
Fallaci was this legendary Italian journalist who could get anyone to say things they shouldn't. And in late 72, she gets Kissinger to open up about his own fame.
And he says what?
He says the main point arises from the fact that I've always acted alone. And then he compares himself to a cowboy from an American Western movie, the cowboy who leads the wagon train by riding ahead alone on his horse.
Which must have made his boss, Richard Nixon, absolutely explode.
Nixon went ballistic. The idea that Kissinger saw himself as the lone hero and Nixon was just, driving the wagon, it was an act of supreme arrogance. Kissinger later said it was the single stupidest interview he ever gave.
But he survived it. He survived Nixon's resignation. He stayed on under Ford. And then when he finally left government, he basically invented the modern career for a post-administration official.
Kissinger Associates. He didn't just retire to a university. He monetized his contacts. He created a consulting firm that charged huge fees to corporations who wanted access to the world's leaders.
If you wanted to do business in China, you hired Kissinger.
Exactly. He wouldn't lobby for you directly. He would just pick up the phone. He was the old friend of the Chinese people, and that opened doors that no one else could.
Which led to another huge controversy after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989.
The Chinese government murders hundreds, maybe thousands of student protesters. The world is horrified. And Kissinger goes on TV and writes op-eds urging against harsh sanctions, arguing that the U.S. shouldn't isolate China.
While his firm, Kissinger Associates, had major corporate clients with billions of dollars at stake in China.
The line between his realpolitik philosophy and his personal financial interests became very, very blurry.
And he just kept going. He remained a relevant voice right up until his death. I mean, he was co-authoring books about artificial intelligence in his late 90s.
It was incredible. He worried that AI-controlled weapon systems would destabilize the nuclear balance he'd worked so hard to create. It was the same old fear of chaos, just applied to a new technology.
And he even changed his mind on major issues, like Ukraine.
He did. For years after Russia's 2014 invasion, he made the classic realist argument that Ukraine should be a neutral buffer state, not a member of NATO.
But after the full-scale invasion in 2022, he completely reversed his position.
In 2023, he said neutrality was no longer an option and that Ukraine should be admitted to NATO to guarantee its security. He adapted his realism to the new reality on the ground.
At 100 years old, he flew to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping.
And he was received like a visiting head of state. She called him an old friend that China would never forget.
So finally, November 2023, at 100 years old, Henry Kissinger dies. And the global reaction was the perfect summary of his life.
It was a perfect Rorschach test.
In Washington, the establishment eulogized him. Biden, George W. Bush, they all talk about his towering intellect and his service to the nation.
But then you looked elsewhere. Rolling Stone magazine's headline was, Henry Kissinger, war criminal beloved by America's ruling class, finally dies.
In Chile, in Argentina, in Cambodia, there were celebrations.
And that really brings us back to the central question. Was he a great man whose cold-blooded realism saved the world from nuclear war by managing the superpowers?
Or was he a man who treated entire nations, Cambodia, East Timor, Chile, as disposable pawns in his game, leaving a legacy of mass death and instability?
He believed, fundamentally, in order over justice.
He did. And that leaves us with a final, I think, very provocative thought for today's world. We're living in a time of growing chaos. We have a rising China, a belligerent Russia, disruptive new technologies like AI. The stable order he prized seems to be fraying.
So the question is, are we drifting back into a world that needs a Kissinger? Does managing this new era of great power competition require that same cold, ruthless realism where smaller nations are once again sacrificed for the sake of stability?
Or have we, or should we, evolve past that? Is the human cost of that kind of order simply too high a price to pay?
Kissinger's answer would be clear. He'd say you can have a world based on justice, or you can have a world based on peace. But in the real world, you can rarely have both.
A sobering thought to end on. If you want to dig deeper into this, I really recommend Gary Bass's book, The Blood Telegram. It is a devastating account of the Bangladesh crisis.
Or for the other side, read Kissinger's own memoirs, White House Years. The sheer intellectual power is undeniable.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.